So welcome, Stéphanie Balme. Today we welcome the Director of the Collège Universitaire Sciences Po, Professor at the Paris School of International Affairs, and Director of the Centre de Recherche Internationale, CERI of Sciences Po. So welcome, Ms. Balme. You have been working at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, you have been professor at the Tsinghua University, and you're an expert on science diplomacy between the EU and China, and more specifically of scientific development of China. So we're gonna ask you a few questions about that. First, I would like to ask you a more general question. That is, how would you describe EU and China relations right now? What are the priorities for both powers, and what are the main challenges they're facing?
Okay. Quite an important question indeed. Well, the way I guess it will be scientifically appropriate and politically appropriate as well to define EU-China, relationships, or more precisely the perspective of EU on China. I would say the EU has moved recently from the idea that China was a partner and a strategic partner into China becoming a systemic rival. I think this is really how it would be very accurate to describe the way the EU look at China. And you can find this definition in a very important document back in March 2019, which is called the EU-China Strategic Outlook. And it has been a joint communication to the European Parliament, the European Council, and the Council itself. And it is really at this moment that they have started to define, this new concept of systemic rival. And I'm quite interested to see that yesterday, June 14th, NATO has also warned that China presents these systemic challenges. And it's quite interesting to see that it's not specific to EU, but it tends to be very specific to the G20 perspective on China.
Yeah, I understand. So actually, I wanted to ask you more a question specifically on the type of diplomacy that China has been applying recently. So some experts have named some Chinese diplomats these wolf warrior diplomats that have been using a different discourse towards diplomatic dialogue with other world powers. What do you think about this?
No, they're definitely wolf warriors diplomats currently. And most of them are posted in G20 countries. And this is not only the way that the West is defining it, but this is the way in China, diplomacy itself, it is called. And it is related to a kind of vocabulary used back during the Cultural Revolution. And really, when we look at the discourse, the type of attitude that these diplomats are actually, implementing, it is very much in the tone of Cultural Revolution. So, of course, it is a source of worrying, of questioning from non-China countries, from countries outside of China. And it can be understood both as China understands itself this. What I mean is the Chinese government is considering that the rest of the world is worried by China's rise. And the reaction of the Western world or the global North is to precisely trying to stop the rise of China. This is a very simple explanation. Partly it's true and partly it's false, but also, this sort of discourse war in between China and the rest of the world is a consequence of a very, highly personalized practice of politics in China. What I mean is not only a one-party system, it's a one-man, one-party system today. And the rise of conservative politics, very conservative politics, and a sort of sometimes xenophobic tones against the rest of the world. So, and definitely a strategy as well within the Chinese political system to play both constructive actions with helps. And during the COVID-19, at the very beginning, when it erupted, you could see a lot of medical aid to several European countries and countries around the world with a so-called vaccine cooperation, vaccine diplomacy, mask diplomacy, the building of a health Silk Road as part of China Belt and Road Initiative project, etc. But also together at the same time an extremely aggressive tone toward the West. And to be completely fair, I think it would be normal to say that the Mr. Trump period, the 4 years during when the US was so aggressive, the US government was so aggressive toward the rest of the world, in particular towards China after China published its 2025 Made in China 2025 plan, didn't help, I would say, a diplomatic tone in between China and the rest of the world.
Okay, so it has been a combination of factors indeed.
Yep, definitely, and it's still going on. It's only the beginning of the exercise, I would say.
Okay, I understand. You have named the COVID-19 crisis. I wanted to ask a very brief question on this. So how do you think it has impacted the EU-China relations? And also how China's handling of this crisis has affected its international image?
Well, I would start from your second question by saying that actually there is a before and after COVID-19, China's relations toward the rest of the world. Well, I would go back to what exactly COVID-19 means. It means where it erupted right in the middle in China, right in the middle of China, in one of its biggest provinces. Hubei province, in one of its biggest city, Wuhan city. And Wuhan is very connected to the rest of the world. And Hubei is also a hub for scientific development. And actually, there was and still is a lab called P4 Lab, which actually is an international Chinese, mainly Franco-Chinese cooperation. And I'm just mentioning it just to say that actually, the effect of COVID-19 is the following. First of all, everyone was, we're not surprised that such a pandemic could erupt in China, because precisely the reason why they have established a P4 lab. They've established a lab for, to deal with infectious disease of a particular type that could only, happen in this part of the world because of the typical biodiversity that exists in this region of the world. And so nobody was, among scientists, if people considered that if such, pandemic could erupt, it necessarily would have erupted in such a region of China. Then what was very particular and specific was the fact that at the beginning, a lot of people considered that China as a government, did not really learn its lessons from the SARS crisis back in 2003, meaning that the fact that the pandemic itself was covered, was not, taken seriously by local authorities, and when it was taken seriously, was not, did not relate to the national government at the Beijing level, at the level of Xi Jinping. And when it did happen, they reached out to WHO, but it was already too late. Well, basically, the whole thing, the fact that it happened there, that they have all the facilities to prevent from this to happening, but because there is a highly, a high level politicization of science in China, and the fact that it's not a transparent country, and that put the world at risk in such a situation, all of this impacted the general understanding and image of China. So we have a situation before COVID-19, the situation was that China was considered as a rival, but its soft power was quite efficient and was quite considered differently, whether you would look at from the global south or the global north. But generally speaking, in many different countries, there was this idea that it was a country and a government that you could trust because it was quite efficient, although it had a very particular way, of ruling its country, and probably, the fact that people would definitely acknowledge that the fact that it was an authoritarian system, but also a very efficient authoritarian system. Yeah. And so that it presented a very different kind of political regime, which could have been considered as a threat for democracy around the world. But yet its soft power was quite important. Today, I would say China's soft power is very, very, very limited. It has been very limited. And also, I guess, the fact that the number of casualties of the COVID-19 in China is still unknown so far. The fact that the WHO, field work trying to understand what happened in Wuhan is very controversial. The whole aggressivity of the diplomat that you mentioned is also part of, this general picture about, how China stands. So I would really say still there is a gap between Global South and Global North in looking at China, but all in all, China's soft power has been suffering very much from the COVID-19 crisis.
Okay, I understand. So, well, obviously this crisis is related to science diplomacy, which is the one of the main topics of this interview that I'm really excited to touch. So you have worked at the French embassy in Beijing on academic and scientific operations, so you have quite a lot of expertise. I wanted to ask you, how do you feel that the field of science and development is evolving in China and has evolved? And how is scientific cooperation with the EU also evolving in this field?
Mm-hmm. So two huge questions. So I would say, first of all, that what we call STI. STI is science, tech, and innovation. So STI have been crucial, have been key to the project of state-nation building in China. I mean, in many countries, but here we're talking about China. And this is true since the end of the 19th century. It's not only true since the beginning of this century. Okay, so since the end of the 19th century, and in particular, since the end of the 20th century, when China, reopened to the world, science has been the key to the project of state-nation building. So, and there are moments of sort of decline and moments of zenith, and we are definitely now today in a moment of zenith. But I think it's first important that people understand that it's not a short-term issue. It's we need to look back to history to really better understand how important science and technology has been important in China. And it's also important because then when you understand this, you understand that our histories are connected. Then since Deng Xiaoping, means 45 years ago, economic liberalization, opening to foreign aids and capitals and all of this, basically what is called the fourth modernization of China, has been developed and hand in hand with science. So to respond to your first question, it's not true to consider that Made in China 2025, which projects China to be the biggest superpower in STI in the next 20 years, is a new project. If there is Made in China 25, it's because there has been a generation, two generations before, about 40 to 50 years of a rebuilding process of an entire scientific ecosystem that really helps China, being able to challenge yourself and to meet your dreams, right? Now with the EU, I would say, China has developed as many relations with many powers in the world, with Japan, South Korea, with the US, and with the EU as well. And we are a very big partner of China in terms of science and technology. If I recall correctly, the first bilateral agreement between EU and China dates back to 1998. Then in 2004, China has joined the very important project in Europe called Galileo. It's a satellite navigation system project. Mm-hmm. And since then, so these last 15 years, basically has developed either partnerships or dialogues or mechanisms for research and innovation cooperation. And among one of those, and very important one, is Horizon 2020. Yes. So Horizon 2020 is definitely a very important project. So I would say, within Horizon 2020, China is the second most important partner. So it's not trivial. It's crucial, and this is really the reason why it's so difficult to deal with China, because we're in a situation of we need to cooperate, and we are a competitor. So, and we are a competitor, and sometimes currently political relations are very tense. So how do you cooperate when you're in a situation of being a competitor and actually there is a lack of trust from both sides? So this is really the difficulty, which is not specific to Europe. What is specific to Europe is because we are divided in 28-1 now countries. You have what, the difficulty that we have is that many countries tend to have bilateral relations with China, basically state level relations with China, instead of, understanding the fact that the only way to deal with the PRC to do it at a European level. And secondly, there are also some countries within the EU which have a very, I would say, lenient understanding of what China politics is about. And we know that it's mainly eastern part of Europe, not only, but and also within the eastern part of Europe, you have countries which are part of the Belt and Road Initiative, including the STI, Science, Technology, Innovation, Belt and Road Initiative. So it makes the situation even more complicated. We are not fully united altogether, yet the European Union science diplomacy towards China is being more and more institutionalized, much less naive than it used to be, much more, I would say, refined, delicate, interesting, trying to understand the different challenges. But we also have this division within the European Union that makes the game really difficult.
Yes. So basically, as you have stated, there are big achievements in this EU-China science diplomacy, but also big challenges that we're still yet to resolve. Yeah. So this is really fascinating. Thank you so much. I wanted to ask you, the last part of this interview was about an article that you wrote, co-authored with Pierre Lemond, and was published in the magazine La Recherche in March 2020. And the title is Un rêve d'hyperpuissance scientifique, which can be translated as a scientific superpower dream. So in this article, you stated that China has the objective of becoming the leading scientific power by 2049, and that there are notable successes, such as becoming the second largest supplier of scientific articles towards the end of the 2000s, the creations of new research institutes, but also important limitations, such as the unequal access to higher education, etc. So how do you think the Chinese government is improving and solving these limitations to achieve their goal? And what are the implications for Europe, of course?
Yeah. No, you're right. First of all, there is a three-step strategy for China, 2020, 2030, and almost 2050, right? So there is this, and at each of these steps, they have particular goals, and this is precisely why. So China is very transparent. I mean, the Chinese government is very transparent in what they want to do and want to achieve. So first of all, I think it's important for each of us who are involved in these issues to try to see the gap between discourse and reality. Because precisely there is sort of strategy which I find fascinating, and I wonder why we don't adopt such a strategy in Europe, which is by simply, articulating a vision, you make others believe that this vision is already implemented. And there's really the power of propaganda and the power of political discourse. And the Chinese government is extremely strong at it, right? So and I really want to emphasize on this aspect, because most of the time we tend to believe that we have weaknesses, a lot of weaknesses, when we compare it to China, this huge, tech dragon. And we do have weaknesses, but we have a lot of strengths as well. And secondly, the real weaknesses of China are hidden by a system that only want to publish positive news, right? So yet, still, once you have said that, it's really true. It's true that China's performance in STI performances are quite, I would say, astonishing and great. And used to be a time when we were talking about emerging countries, Brazil, South Africa, India. When you compare China with this group of countries, definitely China is the fastest country in terms of performances in STI. And not only that, but it has almost reached the level of certain, biggest STI countries in the global north. For example, China is ahead of France in these global innovation index, It's now ranked 15, or 15, I think, when now France is ranking 18 or 19, something like this. So, and if you look at the quantitative measures of STI performances in China, they're amazing. It's always a world's first something, a world's second something, the world's second largest provider of scientific articles, the second largest producer of scientific articles ranked, for example.
It's always behind the US?
It really depends. If you look, for example, in terms of articles on AI, for example, it's now ranked first, for example. It's and it's the world's fastest growing universities, for example, most of Chinese universities are founded a century ago or for 50 years ago, and they are in the top 20, 50, or 100, while some university dating back from the Middle Age in Europe are still not in the top 200 and 300. So this is, the trend is absolutely amazing. And of course, that's also because China hasn't reached yet, threshold, but the trend is really amazing and should make us think about it. So quantitatively speaking, the records of China's STIs, of China STI is quite amazing, I have to say. Now, when you look at it from a qualitative perspective, it's different. For example, I give you a very, very simple example. In terms of publication, China is first. Now, in terms of scientific, the level of internationalization of scientific publication, China is definitely not the first one, meaning that actually one of the key challenges for China is to internationalize its own science and to open up to the rest of the world. So China cooperates with the rest of the world because the rest of the world welcomes, China scientists for many reasons, students, and that's also how science is made of. It's made of international relations. But today, the Chinese government program on attracting talents into China is definitely a failure. And for many reasons, and that which goes back to the question of soft power that we were mentioning earlier on. Which means that at the end of the day, the true question is not whether China can become a huge scientific superpower considering its political system, which means that actually you can definitely be innovative under an authoritarian system. But first of all, when does that stop? When do you reach the threshold level? And another question is, will China be able to be integrated in international scientific community, if it continues to be this sort of authoritarian regime, right? So this is really the kind of question that I think we need to address. Now, and what was your question? The question was about Europe and China on this regard, right?
Yes, I was going to ask you precisely what are the implications for
okay. Well, the implications for the EU and for the rest of the world is to ask oneself one question. Do we want to cooperate with China? Can we stop cooperating with China? So can we stop cooperating with China on STI? The answer is no. Or if it's yes, we're going to lose a lot of time and to really, do a lot of steps backwards. So this is the first question. Do we want to cooperate with China? Of course, it's a political question, a philosophical question. From a scientific perspective, I will say it doesn't make sense not to cooperate with China. And science, that's exactly what science diplomacy is about. Science diplomacy is what you can do with a country, even when you have very tense relations, because this is the last thing you can do before war, right? So if we choose not to develop our scientific cooperation with China, it means somehow de facto that we are ready to enter into a very aggressive, period of our relationships. And of course, it won't be good for citizens, for the rest of the world, and basically it won't meet with European values. So now, once you have solved, I guess, the question of shall we cooperate and do we cooperate, and the answer is yes, then the whole thing, the whole project, and I would say vision and strategy needs to be put in place. It means, what are the issues that we decide to cooperate China with? Under which criteria? And the criteria could be where we're first, where we are sovereign, where we are dominating, these different, topics in terms of STI. do we really need to engage China on this issue, or shall we cooperate with China on the issues where we're very weak? That can be a criteria. It's a very realistic criteria, but it means it's very, very meaningful. It can also be, criteria, for example, shall we, develop our social sciences cooperation? And my answer is yes, because if you want to engage China in AI, in ethics, and this is my third aspect, trying to engage China based on certain scientific values. For example, genome editing, how do you do this? If we're about to, and AI, you might know that actually the EU has published a series of guidelines entitled AI Trustworthy. So the idea of building AI, but for the common good of humanity. China as a country and China's government is really focusing on the development of AI today with very, very minimum ethics guidelines. These could be as well a way to, engage with mainland China. Then, of course, people might say, but this is really wishful thinking and a very European way of considering, cooperation. And what if China doesn't want? What if China want only, fact, materials, money, aids, and don't want to be engaged like this? Well, actually, it's a package. It means that it could be, and when you look at the way Horizon 2020 and now Horizon Europe is, is very, very well accepted in China, and how much China is part of this big, European project, and can only do that according to certain values. I would say this is already the case. China does not cooperate scientifically with Europe by not accepting the rules of the EU, because the EU is basically the part which is paying for this research cooperation. So, and that shows you that we have strengths. We not only have weaknesses, and we can definitely, and that is because also China needs the world and needs the rest of the world. We're not only dependent towards China. China is also, I would tend to say that China needs us more than we need the People's Republic of China on these issues, right? Then there is a little bit of hope, I guess, although it's a very beginning of a new story, but there is a little bit of hope with a change of government in Washington, right? Mm-hmm. So it was quite impossible for many research labs, for many Ministry of Higher Education and Research in Europe to deal directly with the equivalent of the US government under the Trump administration, which was, anti-climate change, anti-Paris Agreement, which was, which tends to have a very, I would say, non-scientific approach to most of these issues. Now that there is a coming back from the US government and with certain values that seems to be allied basically with the European Union, maybe there is a window of opportunity here where not only Europe can say, can really engage with China in terms of values regarding how do we develop STI, but maybe a global north, including Japan, South Korea, and Australia, New Zealand, many other countries, that can gather together to engage China, to engage with China on the most needed ethic guidelines of the 21st century, which are guidelines dedicated to new technologies. The first one being AI and genome editing.
Okay, that's really fascinating. Such a fascinating reflection. But to conclude then, considering all these economic and political factors, do you think that EU-China relations in scientific diplomacy is going to develop well in the next decades, or is it going to, on the other hand, go backwards?
Wow, who knows? I'm a social scientist, so it's extremely difficult, for me just to imagine what's going to happen. And it's really precisely when, it's Helmut Schmidt used to say, when you have a vision, please go and see a doctor. So, well, I think we need to. What we can do is drawing scenarios basically. So if the US and the European Union can ally on values-based realistic STI policy together, and can articulate a policy with China, then there is a lot of hope that we'll be strong enough to really, and by being strong, we'll definitely be able to engage constructively with China. The worst scenario, this is the ideal scenario, and the worst scenario would be that EU and US, don't get along together, and that basically the Chinese government and Chinese politics is becoming even more conservative, and basically trying to play one actor against the other. And this will be the worst scenario, because we will go back to sort of bilateral relations when it's not the EU dealing with China, but it will be the French government at that particular time with the Italian government at that particular time trying to engage with China. And then I think that will go, we'll go backward. And then there is a middle sort of a situation in the middle, where either the Chinese government is becoming more conservative or actually is opening up to the rest of the world, but there is no, I would say, there's a change of political orientation in the EU and in the US, and we are basically going to lose a lot of time. And by losing a lot of time as well, that we create a gap in between our two different STI systems. And in this, it is precisely under these sort of circumstances that the situation we want to avoid, meaning, for example, the decoupling effect of having completely two different or three different separate, new technology systems and I would say scientific systems will develop. And so basically, I think we need to think in terms of scenarios, instead of simply saying, yes, this is going to be an ideal 21st century with great relations with mainland China and Europe, or on the contrary, completely worse. And yet I would just say that what strikes me, and what strikes me very much, is the level of understanding of China's challenges today in Europe, which is much better than what it used to be. And to me, there were two key moments that end this sort of naivety, posture, which was, first of all, the publication of the big plan of Made in China 2025 and the COVID-19, how the Chinese government has reacted and to this policy. So with less naivety on the European side, more sort of willingness to establish a real strategy, and the fact that Chinese government is really more and more conservative. By being more conservative, it implies that actually the reaction from the other stakeholders tend to be even less naive, right? So China is contributing without even wanting it, but is contributing to the building up of a new strategy from Europe.
I see. Oh, thank you so much. This has been a really, really interesting interview. Thank you for being with us. And it has been a pleasure having you with us. And we hope that we'll see you again in the future and have more interesting conversations about EU-China relations. Thank you, Ms. Mal.
Thank you.